All right, welcome to Spotted Lanternfly webinar for grapes and apples and tree fruit. And we've just noticed actually there was an error in the front slide there. We actually have a host of wonderful people, but we're actually building on the work of Julie, Heather, and Dave. And we apologize for that if it caused confusion for anyone. I am just going to keep talking for a moment because I know it takes a few minutes for people to log in once I start the broadcasting. So my name is Jana Hexter. I work with the Northeastern IPM Center based at Cornell University, but we serve the entire Northeast. And I'm here today with some wonderful presenters from New York State and beyond. Actually, most of us from New York State. So I'm just going to move the slide forwards. Okay, so while people are still coming in, there is going to be a recording of this webinar, and it will be posted up within a week on this URL. But I'll also send an email to you once the recording is available with the link, so you don't have to worry about scrambling to write this down right now. It will be coming to you. I'm just going to wait for another minute before I continue, just give people the courtesy of logging in. That's one of the beauties of Zoom. It allows you to have a pre-chat with the presenters, but it also then takes a couple of minutes for people to log in when you do open it up. Okay, so it seems to be slowing down. I think most of you are here. So just to repeat, there is going to be a copy of the recording available, and I'll send you an email. And we do welcome your questions, and there is a feature here on Zoom that is really handy for this. So if you scroll your mouse over your screen, you'll see there's a black bar that comes up, and in the middle of that black bar there's a box that says Q&A underneath. And if you click on that, you can type a question. You can do it anonymously if you prefer. And then we have Nancy Casimano from our team who's going to be monitoring those questions. The beauty of using this system rather than the chat feature is that we get a record of all of those questions at the end and which ones were answered. It's also easier for us to track which questions have been answered already, and as we're moving along. And some of our panelists will answer some of your questions as we're presenting, and also we'll have plenty of breaks where questions can be asked. And all right. So we're doing a series of these webinars. This is the second, and so we worked out a couple of kinks this morning, so you have the benefit of that. And so we have on the call today Julie Carroll, who's the Fruit IPM coordinator with the New York State IPM program. And she works promoting the use of IPM practices by fruit growers to protect their crops. We also have Tim Weigle, who is the Grape and Hop IPM specialist with the New York State IPM program. And he's responsible for extension, implementation, and applied research programming in grape IPM from New York State and the Lake Erie region of Pennsylvania. And Ethan Allen is a senior horticultural inspector at the New York State Department of Ag and Markets. So thank you to all three of you for taking the time to put this presentation together and think about it so thoughtfully, and to take the time to do this today. So before we carry on, we're going to look at an overview of the agenda. We're going to talk about spotted lanternfly biology and identification, how pathways and spread, monitoring and management, and regulatory update. And there's lots of capacity for questions, so please feel free to put your questions in and we'll answer them as we go along. And before we dive into the presentation, we have some questions for you. And I'm going to launch this poll. I think there are 7 questions, and actually the first question is actually at the bottom, so you might want to scroll down and answer that one first. I couldn't get it to move, but here is the poll, and I'm going to give us a couple of minutes for you to answer these questions for us, just so we have a sense of who is on the call and your level of knowledge and awareness, so that we can tailor the presentation to you and to your needs. And I should also add that if you don't know the answers to any of these questions, just take a wild guess. This is not an academic assessment. We just want to get a sense of where people are. And if you have no clue, just choose one that you feel like is a reasonable answer. We have 30% of you have voted so far. We're up to 36 already. So I'm just going to leave it open for about another 30, 40 seconds. And so we have a good representation of your answers, and we'll go through. Okay, give it 10 seconds more and we'll close it up, and I can show you the responses that we got. All right, we've got just about 70% of you responding, so that's great. I'm going to close it up and have you and share the results with you. And we won't go over the answers now, but I will ask one of our presenters to go over at the end. So if you can see here, there's a couple of clear winners in those first 2 questions. The next 2 questions. And there's some variability on where you report sightings and best source of information. And looks like we have a reasonable mix of some people who are extremely knowledgeable, which is great, and then everything in between too. So we have a good mix. All right, so now we've done that. We're going to dive into the presentation, and Tim is going to begin with talking about biology and identification of spotted lanternfly. So take it away, Tim.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon, thanks for joining us. Spotted lanternfly is an invasive plant hopper. It's not a fly, it's a plant hopper. It's native to China and Vietnam, where it typically is not a problem. In some years that really favor its development, it can, populations can peak, but typically they don't worry about it over there. We have found that it feeds on over 70 plant species in the United States. One of the unique things about this is spotted lanternfly is a phloem feeder, so it will drill directly into the plant and pull the sap out of the phloem. They're also swarm feeders. You typically don't see a single spotted lanternfly. You tend to see groups of them when they're feeding. Next slide, please. So here's the spotted lanternfly life cycle. Typically in the colder areas, like in New York State, Pennsylvania, and north, we're going to see 1 generation per year, which is a good thing. If it moves south, then we're going to see where it doesn't require a cold period, so it will actually have the ability to have more than 1 generation per year. Right now, we are in the overwintering stage, which is the egg mass. And you can see May to June, we'll start to see the eggs hatch. You get the first instar. We'll see 4 instars that will go from May through September. Adults will start in July, and they basically go until the first hard freeze, which kills them. We have egg laying from September to December. Next slide, please. So here's the spotted lanternfly egg masses, which is what we're looking for this time of year. You can see on the right-hand side, there's almost look like seeds. They lay them in rows, about 1 inch long, and then they'll cover it with a putty-like substance. It starts out white. It will turn pinkish, brownish, and then as you can see on the right-hand side, it actually starts to weather, it cracks, and it'll look a lot like a splotch of mud on the surfaces. They tend to lay their eggs anywhere. You'll hear that they like to lay it on smooth surfaces, they'll lay it on underneath things, but when populations get high enough, the spotted lanternfly basically is looking for a place to lay its eggs. Females will lay up to 2 egg masses a year, and there's between 30 and 60 eggs per egg mass. Next slide, please. So in the spring, the eggs hatch, and we have the first instar. The first through the 3rd instars are all black with white spots. First instar is about 1/8 of an inch long, and as it moves through its life cycle, gets to that 3rd instar, it's about 3/4 of an inch long. Could I have the next slide, please? The 4th instar will get some red coloration to it, so it's black, white with red spots. And it is about 3/4 of an inch long. And then the adult, you can see on the upper right-hand side, the underwing of the adult has some red on there, and the red for the 4th instar and the adult tend to, typically when you get red on an insect, it is to warn predators away that it doesn't taste good or it can be noxious. So, and it's very pretty, it's striking, and so you'll see it a lot as part of the advertisement. Have you seen spotted lanternfly? And you'll see that pose. But typically what you're gonna see is the adult on the left photo or on the lower right where the wings are closed. They have purplish gray or pinkish gray wings with black spots. Again, a very striking insect. They're about 1 inch in length, so it's a good size insect, and so you get that, and you get swarm feeding, so up to 400 of these adults per grapevine have been reported down in Pennsylvania, and you can see why we consider it to be such a pest. Next slide, please. So how does spotted lanternfly feed? We talked it's a phloem feeder, so it has to get through the outer portion of the plant into the phloem. It has a piercing sucking mouth part, and you can see here the tube within that white box. That's a straw-like mouth part. It basically will puncture. The 4th instar, an adult, can puncture 2nd-year wood, so it can get into tree trunks, the limbs, grape trunks, the cordons, and feed directly on the phloem. The first 3 instars, their mouth parts aren't quite as hard yet, and so they're feeding on the 1st-year growth. And it excretes honeydew, so you can see this mouth part that's going directly into the shoot on a tree there, and it's sucking the phloem out, and it's getting a lot of the sugary sap. It's not looking for sugar, though. It's looking for nitrogen and amino acids, so it has to excrete the sugary sap, and Next slide, please. So what we see is honeydew production, which really is just that sugar being expelled out. So it's honeydew is just a nice word for insect poop. And you can see here on the leaves in the left-hand picture, they look glossy. That's due to the high sugar content that's coming from the honeydew. And you can see a little bit of the black that's starting to grow, and that is honeydew that is using that's sooty mold that's using the honeydew as a substrate to grow. On the right-hand side, there's been enough feeding on this tree that there's oozing of sap from that tree, and you're starting to see fungal mats growing on that honeydew substrate that's leaking out of the tree. Next slide, please. You have questions?
Yeah, Nancy, are there any questions that have come up?
There are no questions.
Wow.
You're doing such a great job, Tim. No one has any questions. Just to remind for people who may have come in a little later, if you have a question, you can just scroll your mouse over your screen. You'll see a black bar with a Q&A box in the middle, and you can type in your question there, and you can also do that anonymously, so feel free to do that. So, so let's move on to the next section, and we can take another question break later on.
All righty.
So, we'll talk about pathways and spread, and I believe, Tim, you're going to present on that too.
Right. Yep. So good. And it shouldn't surprise me there weren't too many questions, because most everybody got the biology questions right in the pre-test or pre-survey. So pathways and spread. It started in Berks County, Pennsylvania. So in southeast Pennsylvania, they figure it came in on a load of stone from Southeast Asia as egg masses. And they figure it was about 2012. It wasn't until 2014 that some folks were wandering through the forests and saw the spotted lanternfly, wondered what it was, happened to have a forester that went out and said, oh, I recognize that, that's spotted lanternfly. So that was in 2014, which is the yellow portion of this. They put a quarantine in place, and you can see even with the quarantine, it spread in 2015. The blue is 2016. The green is 2017. And, you know, some of you might say, wow, the quarantine didn't work. But it also was introduced into South Korea, and it was an invasive pest there as well. And South Korea is about the same size as the state of Pennsylvania. And within a year, it had moved across the entire country of South Korea. So the quarantine, while it didn't keep it in the, seven townships there, it has done a really good job of trying to control the movement, or at least slow the movement of spotted lanternfly across the region. Next slide, please. So it's reported that the population can move 3 to 4 miles a year on their own. I think some of the modeling that's being done by researchers indicate that they think it could be up to 7.5 miles per year. And if that was the case, if all we had to worry about was them walking or hopping or flying 3 to 4 miles, we wouldn't have to worry about it much outside that quarantine zone. Unfortunately, they're excellent hitchhikers. They will jump in and ride in cars, on cars, anything that's moving seems to be able to move this pest with them. The adults and egg masses are the most common life stage to hitchhike. Adults will, as I mentioned, will lay egg masses on almost any surface. They seem to like rusty metal. So if you think about the railroad cars that are coming up from Southeast Asia, you got some rust there. It's not unthinkable that we'll have some egg masses that are laid on those, and they'll come up this direction. So mentioned, typically moved by human activity. You saw that quarantine zone in Southeast PA. If you're getting anything from the quarantine zone, you want to check it for all life stages as it comes up. And I know Ethan will be talking more about quarantines and regulatory actions. We also have a IPM spotted lanternfly checklist on our New York State IPM website. So if you happen to be going to the quarantine zone, or you have people that you know that are going to the quarantine zone, you can print this out, either hand it off or take it with you, and it'll give you a checklist of what you should be doing to ensure that you don't bring spotted lanternfly back with you. Next slide, please. Okay, I mentioned the adults and egg masses are the two most common methods, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore the first four instars. Here you can see the fourth instar, and for whatever reason, they are congregating on a piece of equipment and on the tire there. So if you're not paying attention, you load this piece of equipment up, or it happens to already be on the trailer, and you bring it with you, you just brought a mess of spotted lanternfly up into your area. Next slide, please. So spotted lanternfly distribution, we do have another state to add to this. I just got it yesterday. There was some poinsettia that made it into somebody's house in Boston, Massachusetts, and it had a dead spotted lanternfly on it. So they are thinking that it wasn't an infestation, that the poinsettias came from the quarantine zone in Pennsylvania. But, you know, it's just added to the list. So you can see here that there's, in Pennsylvania, Virginia, New Jersey, Delaware, New York, Maryland, and Connecticut, it's been found in 8 counties in New York, and there it's just been the hitchhikers. They have done surveys, and again, Ethan will talk more about that, but they have found that it seems to be individuals that made it up and not part of an infestation. Next slide, please. So, what do they like to eat? What's the main thing that keeps them going? Spotted lanternfly will feed on over 70 different plant species, but they strongly prefer the tree of heaven, or Ailanthus altissima. You can see here that it looks a lot like sumac. It has compound leaves. In the lower left-hand picture, there's 30 leaflets on that compound leaf. It's about 1 yard long. The trunk looks a lot like a cantaloupe, the skin there. And if you're looking at the leaves, you see that they have smooth margins and they have lobes at the base of the leaflet. And that's a good way to tell Ailanthus from, or tree of heaven from, sumac. Also, Ailanthus has both male and female trees. The female tree has samaras, or their seeds there, and they can produce hundreds of thousands of those on a good sized tree. It's a fast growing tree, but short lived. It typically lives about 30 years. Next slide, please. And this is the range. So tree of heaven zone 4 to 8, it was introduced to Philadelphia in 1784, so it's an invasive species as well. Introduced in California in the 1890s, so you can see that it has pretty much taken over the United States since then. Spotted lanternfly will feed on those 70+ plants, but they do like Ailanthus. That seems to be their preferred host, especially for the 4th instar and the adults. So keys to correct identification of Ailanthus: look at the leaf margins. As I mentioned before, Ailanthus has no serrations or teeth. The native species like hickory, black walnut, and sumac, staghorn sumac, all have serrated leaf margins. The leaf scar on Ailanthus it's very, very large. And one of the keys that I've found is just a foul odor. If you crush the foliage or break the twigs, there's a definite odor that's noticeable. Some have likened it to rancid peanut butter. Some have said it smells like the bottom of a Cheerios box when the Cheerios are gone. I guess just if you crush it and smell it, you'll be able to tell the difference, because if you crush the foliage of the black walnut or sumac or the hickory, you just get a vegetative smell rather than that foul odor. Next slide, please. So plants at risk, we mentioned it's feeding on 70+. Reports out of Southeast PA say it'll feed on pretty much anything. If it is in one place and it needs to get over to one of its preferred hosts, it will feed on anything on the way, but it typically doesn't set up shop and continue to feed. So the plants at risk, grapes, apples, hops, some of the other tree fruits have been mentioned, but not necessarily confirmed that it's a huge problem. Talking to Heather Leach down at Penn State, she's with the extension program there and the spotted lanternfly coordinator. She has said that grapes tend to be the favorite, And if apples are close by and populations get high enough, she's seen them move into apples, but then they will spend a week maybe and then move on. And with hops, she really hasn't seen, at least down in their area, that it has been a huge problem. Ornamentals, we're seeing a lot of movement with nursery and ornamentals from the quarantine zone. That's one of the ways that we're seeing it move. The lumber industry, Christmas trees, not necessarily because of the feeding that they do, but because that they're laying their egg masses on the trees. And then there is concern about moving those egg masses with the products as you ship them outside the region. Residential shade trees, we have seen where it moves from the vineyards in the fall to residential areas. They'll feed on the river birch. A lot of maples, they tend to prefer silver maple. Red maple is second, and sugar maple is third. So if you don't have silver maple or red maple and sugar maple is there, they will definitely feed on those. Next slide, please. And it's not only the plants that are in danger, it's also can impact the quality of life. On the right-hand side here, there's a black cherry tree in somebody's backyard in the quarantine zone in Burke County, and the roughness there are spotted lanternfly adults that are just covering that tree, and they go all the way up into the canopy. They're up there, and remember we talked about them being phloem feeders. They're pulling all the sap out. You can imagine how much honeydew is being produced when you have this type of population. So it rains down. People have commented that they feel like they're prisoners in their own homes in August through October because of the amount of honeydew that comes down. This step, you can see the top two steps. There was honeydew that hit. Sooty molds grew on that honeydew substrate. And this bottom step is where they have power washed the honeydew and the sooty mold off. And you can see that they didn't get it all off. So I think that will move us to questions.
Lovely,
Yeah,
thank you.
I have a few. What about native relatives like shadblow or serviceberry, relative of apple? Was that a host?
What was the first one? Hang on.
Are trees like shadblow or serviceberry affected?
You know, I am not sure.
I would agree. This is Juliet, Carroll. I think there's still a lot that we're learning about the hosts in North America for this insect.
To what hardiness zone will it survive and cause harm?
The spotted lanternfly, I believe that from a research paper I was reading the other day, that it will be able to survive in areas up to the point where the average winter temperature is 6.9 degrees Fahrenheit. So, and one of the things that we're looking at is that as you make the drive from the quarantine zone to State College in Pennsylvania, as you start moving up in elevation through the mountains, you see that there's tree of heaven doesn't really grow as much. And so they're trying to figure out, the research that's being done is tree of heaven a preferred host, or is it a host that they must have to complete their life cycle? So like Julie just mentioned, there's a lot of research that needs to be done. There's a lot of questions that aren't answered yet. So I really don't know if we can give a good answer as to what is the range of this pest right now.
Do any vegetable crops serve as hosts?
No, they are not preferred hosts, or at least they haven't been shown to be preferred hosts, but that doesn't mean that the spotted lanternfly will not feed on them. It's, they're going to be a food of convenience as they move to preferred hosts.
Does the sooty mold make things slippery?
I don't know if it makes it slippery as much as it makes it sticky, because it is sugar. But I don't know if you add sooty mold to that, if that changes that.
And the last question, what does the damage look like on apple trees and how does it harm the tree?
Oh, I see Julie.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself, right?
Yep.
So I think basically how this insect damages trees in general and vines is that it's removing sugars from the tree, so it's starving the trees and excreting excess sugar in the honeydew so that it has a proper protein to carbohydrate balance to live on. If the insects swarm on the trees and mass feed on trees and sap, remove enough of the sap, they can weaken the trees. At this point in time, it does not look like they stay long to feed on apple trees. In other words, at least in Pennsylvania orchards, they will swarm onto the trees, feed for a while, and then leave. And one of the thoughts is that because they don't have pumps that actively pump the sap of the plant in through their stylets, like a lot of other plant hoppers have, that once the turgor pressure in the host drops, they can no longer get the sap from that tree and they move on. So the way they would damage any tree is by removing carbohydrate, weakening the trees, potentially affecting their ability to survive the winter, be more sensitive to cold, so reducing cold winter hardiness, and potentially affecting return bloom.
Thank you very much. So shall we move on to the next section? And please keep asking your questions. We'll come back to them again. So we're going to look at monitoring and management. And here's the first slide on that one.
Okay, great, thanks. So the good news is currently no infestations in New York State. Really anywhere outside of that quarantine zone in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, there's an infestation in one of the counties in Delaware and Virginia. But other than that, we're really, as far as management goes, the best management is monitoring and learning how to properly identify and report all the life stages. If you find it, we report it. You see on the right-hand side there, they're using tree banding down in Pennsylvania, where it's just a sticky tree band. The nymphs like to, especially the first 3 instars, like to move up and down the tree trunks. And so they will get stuck on that. It's not as effective for the 4th instar and the adults, but we'll still see some collection of that. They see it as a management tool for the first 3 nymphs, but also a monitoring tool to let you know if spotted lanternfly is around. So if you have Tree of Heaven, we talked about that was a preferred host. If you have Tree of Heaven, you can put some banding on that, and that will help you monitor. And you can go back and check that out every once in a while. One caution I have with using the sticky bands is that it doesn't just catch the spotted lanternfly, it will catch other beneficial insects. There's been some concern, especially with the heavier industrial type, that it's also caught birds and bats that came in for a free meal. So again, monitor vehicles and shipments. If you're getting anything from the quarantine area, look for all life stages of this pest. Next. Mentioned in the last slide about proper identification and correct identification. The tick, there was Christmas trees that came out of Pennsylvania, went into New Jersey, and somebody bought one, took it into their house, set it up. And because they don't have a cold requirement, it doesn't have to, the egg mass doesn't have to have a chilling at a certain temperature for a certain length. As soon as it warmed up, the egg mass hatched, and they had all sorts of spotted lanternfly cruising around. People called and thought that they had ticks in their tree, and it turned out to be first instar spotted lanternfly. So if you don't know what they look like, you can mistake them for ticks. Also, green stink bug nymphs, you can see the different types there, can be misidentified. So make sure you know how to identify the pest. Next. So if you find spotted lanternfly in New York, and the question was asked in the past one, well, what happens if I'm not in New York? If you Google spotted lanternfly and the state you're in, you will typically come up with how to report if you found spotted lanternfly. But in New York State, we ask that you take a photo, and if you can put a coin by it or just something for reference of size, take that photo and then send it via an email to spottedlanternfly@dec.newyork.gov. And then what you want to do is you want to send that in and also give the location. So if you have a street address and zip code, that's great. If you're out away from residential areas, if there's road intersections that you can send in, that would be great. Or if you can pull up the GPS coordinates on your cell phone and use that. Just want to know the location of that. So grab the life stage that you find, remove it, kill it, put it in a sealed bag, and then put it in the freezer. So then when you do report it, they will contact you, and it'll be really handy to be able to look at that and confirm, number one, that it is spotted lanternfly, and then they can move on from there. So for more information, you can visit the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation website. And I think one of the questions was, where can you get information? And I think all those answers are correct, whether it's the DEC website, the New York State IPM website, the Northeast IPM website. There's just a lot of information out there about spotted lanternfly. Next. So management, looking ahead, you know, as I said, right now we're actually in a good place because we don't have infestations, but we are looking to make sure that we're ready in case it does come. So we're looking at FIFRA 2EE recommendations using the work that's being done by Dr. David Bidinger down at Penn State University. He's looking at tree fruit and grapes along with Erica Schmeyers, Julie Urban, and Heather Leach. And so we can take the information they have and actually apply for spotted lanternfly to be added to insecticide labels in New York State. New York State's a little bit different than some of the other states. In New York State, you have to have both the site, so like a site would be grapes or apples, and you also have the pests. So you'd have to have a insecticide labeled for use in grapes with spotted lanternfly on the label. In other states, all you have to have is the site. So in Pennsylvania, that's the way it works, is as long as that insecticide is labeled for use in grapes, you can use it against spotted lanternfly in grapes. We're also developing a database of insecticides that are labeled, you know, just for the general plant hoppers, as spotted lanternfly falls into that category. Next slide, please. So you can see here, using the work by Dr. Bidinger, working with Greg English Loeb at Cornell, who's with the entomology department, he was able to apply for 2EE recommendations for 11 insecticides. We have 8 active ingredients there. This information will be up on the New York State IPM website and also through all your local extension offices or regional grape programs. And I am going to, I guess another thing I want to mention about this is one of the reasons that we looked at including so many different active ingredients is so you could do the rotation down in Southeast PA where it's a real problem in vineyards. Some of the premium wine growers have applied insecticides every 3 to 5 days to control spotted lanternfly because they'll kill it, but the populations just keep coming in from outside the vineyard. Others have looked at waiting until the adults come in and then tried to time so they spray 3 to 5 applications total during the season. So we have a lot of active ingredients there, hoping that people will rotate that and basically have a good resistance management program. And so I'm going to turn it over to Juliet for the next slide.
Right, so building on what Tim was just saying about resistance management, what I've put on this slide in this table is the IRAC group. And the IRAC, that's the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee. That number, if it is the same number, that means that insecticide is in the same class, having the same mode of action against the insects as all others in that class. So for instance, Mustang Max and the 2 brigade formulations are in IRAC group 3A. Interestingly, brigade, we were only able to get the 2 EE recommendations on pear in New York State. Art Agnello in the Department of Entomology applied for these 2 EE labels. For apple, we have Imidan, Mustang Max, Avant, and Danitol that can be used. But interestingly, the research that's been done on efficacy of these materials in Pennsylvania has been done on potted peach trees. You can imagine it's difficult to do research on these materials when you've got a quarantine pest that's difficult to rear in the laboratory. But basically, Mustang Max was not showing very good efficacy against spotted lanternfly in the trials in Pennsylvania. However, Mustang Max, we know, washes off the plant surface fairly readily, and the last summer when they were doing this research, they had a lot of rain. So that may have affected the efficacy in that trial. So the other thing to look at is that most of these materials are restricted use pesticides. There are restrictions on the label, whether it's restricted use on Long Island or you have to be a certified applicator to apply them. Definitely it's important to read the label and to have that 2 EE label in your possession if you were to need to use these. I know that Tim and I are very hopeful, and I know many of us in the IPM program are very hopeful that through monitoring and quarantine efforts, we can continue to keep spotted lanternfly out of New York State and not have to reach for the insecticide as our management tactic. That's all I have. You can go to the next slide, Jana.
Okay, thank you, Julie. So some of the frequently asked questions is spotted lanternfly a vector for viruses or bacterias? And we haven't found that or haven't seen that as yet in Pennsylvania or through the work that they've been looking at the literature from Korea and China and haven't seen that. So that's the good news. And also, are there biological control agents available? And next slide, please. So the good news is that they are finding some biological controls which are doing something against spotted lanternfly. The gypsy moth parasitoid was introduced for gypsy moth. It's not reported on spotted lanternfly in China, but researchers have found that about 7% parasitism of available egg masses. And of the egg masses that are parasitized, about 20% of the egg in the egg mass is parasitized. So that's good news because it's there. It's only found in some locations, however, so they're looking at how do we improve the population or bring that population up so it can be used to help control. So again, about 7% of the egg masses, 20% of the egg mass or eggs were parasitized. Next slide, please. So obviously that egg parasitoid wasn't going to take care of the problem all by itself, which usually biological control, one biological control won't do it. You try and use several. So they went to China to look for other parasitoids, and they found an egg parasitoid, another little wasp that's widely distributed throughout China. And the parasitism they found ranged from 0 to 2% of egg masses, and from 0 to 20% or 26% of the total eggs in the egg mass. So they've brought that over. That's in quarantine right now at APHIS in Maryland, or excuse me, Massachusetts. Next slide, please. And then there's another one that is not an egg parasite, but it actually attacks the second and third instars. So it will overwinter as a cocoon. If you look on the lower right-hand picture there, the white bulge at the bottom is the cocoon that is formed. It's killed the instar and is ready to create more parasitoids, which is good news. So 40% parasitism reported in the Chinese literature. So if you start looking at, now we have a couple different egg parasitoids. We have a parasitoid that will attack the nymphs. We're starting to get to the point where you can see where biocontrol might have a good place. And this one is actually, they brought it in and it's quarantined at an ARS lab. Next slide, please. So we have the parasitoids. Do we have fungal pathogens? Research by Dr. Ann Hajic at Cornell University. She's looking at two different fungal pathogens. The first is the Beruvia species, and we found that down in Pennsylvania when we were looking in vineyards, and it's just, it's there. It's naturally there. They didn't spray anything trying to get it established, so that's good news that it is doing some work on its own. The question is, how do we get it to the point where it can be at population levels that are actually controlling it down to a dull roar? And then there's an unknown fungi that's closely related to Entomophaga species. It's believed to be related to the gypsy moth fungal pathogen. So again, we have the gypsy moth parasitoid and then one of the fungal pathogens. So did a good job on gypsy moth. We're hoping it'll do the same for spotted lanternfly. I think we'll move to questions.
And I'm actually going to suggest we skip over this question break and move into the regulatory update and then have answer the questions after that. So Ethan, would you like to jump into the regulatory update?
Absolutely, appreciate it. So first off, you'll notice here that the logos on the slides are both Department of Environmental Conservation and New York State Ag and Markets. I work for New York State Ag and Markets, but the response for spotted lanternfly here in New York State is being coordinated by both New York State DEC as well as my agency, New York State Ag and Markets. And we have several partners collaborating with us and helping us with that. Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, the United States Department of Agriculture, specifically Plant Protection and Quarantine, New York State Department of Transportation, as well as Cornell Cooperative Extension, of course, the New York State IPM program, and the Partnerships for Regional Invasive Species Management. So it's a very collaborative effort going into trying to prevent spotted lanternfly from coming in and also trying to prepare for when or if it arrives. Next slide. So my focus today is going to be on regulatory actions that are being put into place here in New York, and I'm going to talk about quarantines. And I think the first thing that I want to stress about quarantines is that it's not a complete shutdown of commerce. A lot of times people think of quarantines as in the case of a health outbreak where everybody's sequestered to a certain area and isn't able to leave. When we deal with plant pest quarantines, that's not the case. We identify what we consider regulated articles, and those are things that we believe could vector or move a plant pest. And then we define ways in which we allow those regulated articles to move out of the quarantine area that have proper safeguards that will not allow plant pests to move on them. In many cases, it's pretty simple. So for example, like emerald ash borer, we knew that the primary host there was ash, and so we could regulate ash firewood, ash nursery stock, ash logs, ash lumber, anything that was being made out of ash. We're dealing with one very specific commodity. As you heard Tim mention, spotted lanternfly can be moved on so many different things, whether it be via egg masses that could be laid on anything, or as the insect itself can hitchhike. It can get into cars, it can get onto people, it can just be vectored a number of ways. So when we look at the regulated articles further on, you're going to see it's a very complex list of regulated articles and how we're regulating this pest. And again, keep in mind, quarantines are put in place to prevent movement of plant pests. And so our quarantine that we've put in place is to help protect New York State. And the next map will illustrate that. If we can move to the next slide. So this is a map that was put together by the New York State IPM program. And Tim showed this map early on. It illustrates some of those, what we consider incidents in the orange areas, in the orange counties where spotted lanternfly has shown up as dead spotted lanternfly and no infestations. But what I want to focus in on this map for everybody on the webinar today is the blue areas. And those blue areas are areas that we know that are infested with spotted lanternfly. And those are the areas that we have placed an exterior quarantine on. So New York State has enacted a regulation and put in that regulation a quarantine on these areas to help protect New York and also some of the New England states, because you have to drive through New York to get to those states in the New England area. You'll also notice a red line around some of those blue areas. And those red lines indicate that those states have enacted their own quarantine to try and prevent the spread of spotted lanternfly within their own state and beyond. So you'll see that Pennsylvania has put in a quarantine on their own state. New Jersey has done the same. You'll notice down in Virginia has not implemented a quarantine, but is under quarantine by New York State. And Delaware has an infestation with no quarantine. Delaware is in the process of implementing a quarantine. It's under public review, public comment period, I should say. And so we anticipate that that quarantine will be put into place in the near future. Next slide. So one of the other misconceptions that a lot of people talk about, or you hear people talking about, is that the entire state of Pennsylvania is under quarantine. The entire state of New Jersey is under quarantine. And that's not correct. When we quarantine areas and when those states have quarantined their own areas, they look very specifically at the areas that are infested, and they choose a geopolitical boundary. So in this case, it's counties. And you'll notice here in our regulation, which is what you see above, Part 142, the quarantine area described down below, is the 13 counties that are infested in Pennsylvania, and you can see those listed there. 3 counties in New Jersey, I jumped a line there, apologize. A county in Virginia and a county in Delaware. And as the infestation expands out, we'll expand our quarantine area out as well. So it's just the counties that are infested that we're regulating, not the entire state. And that's important when we talk about movement of materials back and forth between those states and our state. Next slide, please. So I mentioned regulated articles and how complex that can be. And you can see here in Part 142.3 of the regulated articles in our quarantine, it lists out a whole bunch of things. I have a couple things highlighted here in red that I want to draw your attention to. First and foremost, the spotted lanternfly in any life stage is a regulated article. So if you have live spotted lanternfly or egg masses, either on your vehicle, on your camper, in your car, on your person, that's a regulated article. And therefore, you know, if it's moving without a permit, that's a problem. We had a question in the last webinar. Somebody was asking about, you know, for educational purposes, if they can move spotted lanternfly. And so there's some issues around that. The other one is landscaping material, remodeling, construction waste. So we've seen spotted lanternfly moving on stone. You know, it very easily could be moved on other types of products like that associated with the landscape industry, construction waste. We've seen it move on nursery stock, so associated with landscape projects. The other one I want to highlight there is packing material. So all those orange counties that you saw listed in New York and other states, most commonly that's associated with movement of products into those counties and into facilities that are doing business. And most of it's been associated with packing material. So a lot of times you'll see material shrink wrapped, and in the wintertime, or we get into the late fall, when it gets cold out, spotted lanternfly becomes real sluggish, and it's trying to find areas that it can warm up in. So it'll go underneath the packing material, the wrapping. It'll also lay its eggs on pallets and other packing material. So this is a big vector for spotted lanternfly that we're concerned about and regulate. I mentioned nursery stock. So again, plants and plant parts. So when we talk about plant parts, we're talking about logs and lumber and things of that nature, but obviously plants that would be used in the nursery industry or in the orchard industry, the vineyard industry. When you're getting your plants in, you really need to know where they're coming from and be aware of spotted lanternfly. Outdoor household articles. This is a huge one. Anything that's stored outside. That could be vehicles, campers, boats, grills, shovels, anything that's outside that spotted lanternfly could have a chance to lay its eggs on or get into and be harbored by that is regulated. And then of course, we have sort of a catch-all on the bottom there that basically says anything that we believe that could be infested or be harboring spotted lanternfly is also regulated. So these are the things you need to consider when you're moving down to the quarantine area or moving things out of the quarantine area. So the next part of the regulation talks about how things can move out. And again, a lot of people think of quarantine as a complete shutdown, and that's not the case. As you can see here, regulated articles can move out of the quarantine area if they're accompanied by a certificate of inspection, which is highlighted there in red. Certificates of inspection is our terminology, and it meets our definition, but in Pennsylvania, they have a permitting program, and they refer to it as a permit. Don't get hung up on the terminology of certificate of inspection and permit. The permit meets the definition of a certificate of inspection, and we accept that. So that would be something that would have to accompany that shipment to its destination. There is also sort of an agreement amongst the states of reciprocity. So if you have a Pennsylvania permit, it would be accepted in New Jersey, it would be accepted in New York, and most of the states are using the Pennsylvania permitting process. And the other point I want to make about the certificate of inspection is, where do you get that? That would be by the home state. So it doesn't come from New York, it comes from the state that you're working out of. A couple other points before we move on to the next slide. All the shipments that come into New York and through New York have to be accompanied by a waybill. That allows us as regulators to identify where it came from. So did it come from a spotted lanternfly quarantine area, and where it's going to, so we can identify its destination if that destination is at risk. If you could just go back to the last slide for just a second, thanks. And so that waybill is required. There's also a requirement that if you are coming from outside of the quarantine area, that you move directly through the quarantine area without stopping. So for example, if you're in North Carolina and you're destined for somewhere in upstate New York, if you're traveling along 81, you're going to travel through the quarantine area. You're allowed to stop for traffic conditions and obey by the traffic codes and laws and get gas. But if you stop and spend the night or spend a period of time in that quarantine area, then you're subject to the regulation and you have to have a certificate of inspection. And this is important because if you spend a period of time in the quarantine area, you could inadvertently have your shipment or your vehicle infested by spotted lanternfly. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about certificates of inspection and permits. This kind of outlines exactly how to go about that process. There's an online permitting system and training that's done. It's hosted by Penn State University through an agreement through Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. So the first step is to go to Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture's website, which is listed there. You're going to click on the spotted lanternfly link on the left side of the page and click the quarantine box, and that'll get you into the permit training. You're going to want to review the permit training link under business resources. You can take a test, and then they're going to ask you, once you pass that test, after you go through the course and take the test, they're going to ask you how many permits you want. They do set a limitation on how many permits based on how many people are trained, and there are certain provisions and agreements that you have to adhere to. But this is really sort of the gold standard of what's been going on for regulation for spotted lanternfly. So even if you're not residing in Pennsylvania, let's say you're a resident here in New York and you have a business and you're doing business down in Pennsylvania, you're bringing your product down there, or you're going down there to pick product up and ship it back into New York, you need to have this permit, not only to abide by New York State's regulations, but also Pennsylvania's regulations. Next slide. The last point, we've talked a little bit about management, or I should say a lot about management, but specifically on management, one of the best lines of defense is those of you that are on the webinar looking at the products that you're bringing into your businesses, the plants that are coming in. You really should be looking at everything that's coming in and inspecting it for signs of spotted lanternfly. You should also be looking at it to see if it has the proper paperwork that should be coming in with it. And there's two things that I want to bring to your attention with respect to plants specifically. Any plants that are shipped into the state of New York are required to have a certificate of inspection, regardless of where they came from. That is in Article 14. That's a very old law that's set up to protect agricultural industries here in New York from getting plant pests in. If you get plants in and you don't have a certificate of inspection, you should contact us immediately. The second piece of paperwork that you should be seeing is Spotted Lanternfly permit or certificate of inspection if that shipment is coming from the quarantine area. One of the things you want to do is be aware of where you're purchasing product from. Are you purchasing it from the quarantine area? And if so, is that company compliant? There are a list of compliant companies on Pennsylvania's website, as well as New Jersey, and some of the other states have their compliant companies listed. So you definitely want to do your homework there and work with your vendors on whether they're compliant or not. And then when you get that shipment again, please look at everything included in the shipment, not just the plant material that you're lining up, but any other products, the packing material, everything associated with that. It's very important. Next slide.
Great, and I just want to be mindful, it's already 2 o'clock, so it would be good to wrap this up.
Yep. So again, take home message here, learn to identify all life stages of spotted lanternfly. Tim went through that in great detail, very easy to identify versus other pests. Inspect all the items coming out of the quarantine zone, as I mentioned earlier. If you're visiting the quarantine zone, inspect your vehicle inside and out before departure. Make sure you get the proper permits and certificates of inspection. And if you see it, report it. And you'll see that in New York, we want it reported to this particular website here or this email address. But in other states, if you're in Pennsylvania, they have their own reporting system. As Tim mentioned, Google search, you can find it. And again, New York State IPM program has a ton of spotted lanternfly resources, especially that checklist, which is great. So thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And so what we're going to do now is, and there are a couple of questions about current quarantines and safeguards, Ethan, so maybe you could have a look on the Q&A and type in answers to those, and if not, we can ask them live. But I'm going to also launch a poll just to ask you those same questions we did in the beginning, and feel comfortable about it. It's just for us for evaluation purposes. So I'm just going to launch that poll and ask you to just take a minute or a couple of minutes to respond to those, and then we'll finish up with some last answering your last questions and a couple of other materials to share with you. And so I'd be grateful if you would do that. And don't feel intimidated by it. Just if you still don't know the answers, just guess. It's totally fine. And actually, Tim, when we finish with this, maybe you can say what the correct answers are. People have asked that earlier.
Yep, just let me know when you want, and we can run through these. And
Okay, I'm just going to give people a little bit of time.
Yep.
We have 10% of people have voted so far, so I'm just going to give people time to respond. And there's also an option at the end of there to ask for a certificate of completion for this webinar too. So please check yes if you'd like a certificate of completion, and I will send that to you. And that's at the bottom of this poll. Okay, I'm going to give you 20 more seconds. Great. So we have 55% of you have weighed in. Still getting a couple more. I'll just give you a few more seconds. And I'm going to end it. Great. And Tim, so would you like to answer the correct answers for this?
Well, the questions just went away.
Oh, there you go. I have to share them. There we go.
Thank you. So you guys know your first. That's very nice that most of you are at least moderately knowledgeable. And this splotch of mud is the correct answer for an egg mass starts out white but ends up as a splotch of mud. Prime characteristics traits for the first 3 instars is black with white spots. Very good. What makes the 4th instar easily identifiable from the first 3? It turns red with white spots. And what is the prime characteristic trait you would be looking for to identify the adult spotted lanternfly? And it is approximately 1 inch long. The outer wings have black spots. Where should you report sightings of spotted lanternfly? In New York State, it is spotted lanternfly at dec.newyork.gov. If you make a mistake and send it to us, we will make sure that we get it reported to the right place, though. And what is the best source for spotted lanternfly information in New York State? And again, I think the IPM program, New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the local extension office, we're trying to get the information out to all those guys. The Northeast IPM Center, I think any of those would be a good place to go for information.
Great. All right. Lovely. Thank you very much. And for the 26 people who said they would like a certificate of completion, I will do my best to get that out to you within the next few days. And it looks like yes, so it looks like there's one question outstanding. And somebody's actually responded to that on taking out the tree of heaven. So great. So I want to follow up with a couple of things. We have on our website a Find a Colleague page where it's to encourage collaboration with throughout the Northeast, and you can put on there your contact information and the kind of collaboration you're interested in and doing research or outreach and education. Feel free to go there and add your information. A recording of today's webinar will be up on our website, and I will send you an email with a link when that's ready. Probably will be early next week when that's ready for you, and you can watch it as often as you like. And we have 2 more webinars coming up, one for Christmas tree growers next Monday, and one for nursery, greenhouse, and landscape industries. It'll be very similar to this one, but have a little focus for those particular industries. And feel free to share about this in your network if you found it helpful. Please let other people know about the upcoming webinars and also the recordings. And with that, I just want to say a deep gratitude to all our presenters and Cornell Cooperative Extension and New York State Ag and Markets, the New York State IPM program, and the people that make the Northeastern IPM Center possible, which is NIFR, which is a part of USDA, without which none of this would be available. So thank you. And yeah, deep bow of appreciation to our presenters for everything that it took to be ready for this presentation through their careers and the time that it's taken to put this together. I know it's taken an effort. So, and if any questions come up for you afterwards, feel free to email me and I'll forward them on to Tim and the other presenters. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jana. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.
I do see that there's one question still out there. Should Tree of Heaven be removed from your property? And there's no good answer for that. I think the research is still being done on that. There have been some reports of people removing Tree of Heaven and saying that they've seen a decrease, but also removing Tree of Heaven could also make it where then the crop that you're trying to protect becomes more favorable for feeding by spotted lanternfly because they don't have the Tree of Heaven. So there is some work being done in Pennsylvania of removing some of the Tree of Heaven. They get rid of the female trees, leave a few male trees as sentinel trees or trap trees. They'll inject that with a systemic insecticide. So when the spotted lanternfly come to feed on those trees, they are killed. But they're still trying to determine if that is a long-term solution. So just want to be really careful. Tree of Heaven is like sumac in that if you cut it down and you don't treat the stumps with herbicide or do a lot of hand pulling of the shoots that come out, because they will sprout from the roots, that you can cut down a single tree and end up with a grove because of the growth that comes out of the roots. So if you're going to do it, read up on removal. There is a lot of good information. Penn State has some good information on how to effectively manage Tree of Heaven stands.
There was one sort of question comment in the chat that I would like to address. The question or statement was, DEC was very secretive about the spotted lanternfly found in Penn Yan and Albany. After FOIL requests, they would only say that one was found in Penn Yan and a female, but not a reproductive stage. So I just want to address those two things. First off, we jointly, New York State Ag and Markets and DEC, did a press release on both of those finds, so it was out in the public. In terms of the location, we typically do not disclose the exact location to protect either the landowner or the business. But what I will say is the one in Albany was found live. We did extensive surveys around that area and were not able to find it. The person that had found it had not traveled out of the state with that vehicle. And so we were not able to reproduce, where that population was. We think it was maybe just a stray that had come in on a shipment or something, but we will continue to monitor that area and survey that area aggressively coming up again this year, as we did last year. The issue in Penn Yan really scared us a lot because it is in grape production area. And so we did extensive surveys up and down around that lake. We had people on boats surveying the edge of the lake. We had people on the ground surveying. We surveyed all the vineyards around there. It was found on a private property, was not found in a vineyard, found on a private property. We surveyed that property multiple times, and we will continue to survey that property and around that area multiple times. So I'm not so sure about the secretive nature of it, but we do want to protect landowners and businesses, from that information getting out. But in terms of the other information about those finds, they were very public, and we did press releases, and there was a lot of news stories around them. So just to trying to clear the air on that particular situation. And then the other question that came up is DEC regulating the quarantine? And no, it's an Ag and Markets quarantine. So where you see the mention of the department, it refers back to New York State Ag and Markets. So this is, Ag and Markets has plant pest regulatory authority over all plant pests. And so that's why we've implemented a quarantine to protect the agricultural and horticultural industries in New York State, as well as other sections of other markets in the state as well. So it's a New York State Ag and Markets quarantine regulation.
Great. Thank you very much. Is there anything anyone else wants to add before I close up the webinar?
This is Julie, and I just wanted to ask you, Ethan, whether the findings are posted on the DEC website. A press release is great, but it might not be picked up by a newspaper locally.
So the press releases themselves are posted on the website, both DEC and Ag and Markets. All press releases are publicly posted and they're available for review. In terms of specific findings, I don't know that we have anything listed by date when it was found, but there is mentions of a finding in Albany County and in the county name escapes me, but over in Penn Yan, over in there. So, and again, you know, we share that information with the IPM program that's being updated on the IPM map that both Tim and I had in the webinar today. So we do try to share that information as much as possible, but also cognizant of trying to protect landowners and businesses that are reporting it so that they aren't inadvertently, you know, getting the finger pointed at.
Great. All right, well, thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing folks on the next webinar, which is March 4th. And thank you for your attendance and your interest and your great questions. Okay, bye.